The words came out of Bernard Sullivan's mouth like a confession pulled from the deepest, most hidden chamber of his chest, and Effie Covington felt the ground beneath her boots shift, as though the red Kansas earth had decided, in that precise moment, to swallow her whole. "I have fixed that latch every week," he admitted, his voice low and rough as gravel dragged over dry creek bed, his dark eyes refusing to look away from hers even though every instinct she had screamed that he should, that she should, that someone in this tiny, sweltering doorway needed to look away before something irreversible happened. "Because it gives me a reason to come by." The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of two people who had known each other long enough to stop filling every moment with noise. It was the kind of silence that cracked open the world and showed you everything underneath it, every secret motive, every hidden truth, every lie you had told yourself in the dark hours before dawn when honesty is the only companion left. Effie's hand was still pressed flat against the doorframe of her modest homestead, the latch in question hanging loose and crooked just as it had every single Tuesday morning for the past 4 months, ever since Bernard Sullivan had first appeared at her door with his toolbox and his quiet eyes and his absolute refusal to charge her a single cent for the repairs. She had thought him kind. She had thought him neighborly. She had, in her more foolish moments, thought him perhaps a little simple, because what man of apparent intelligence would fail to make a permanent repair when the solution was so obviously within his skill? The answer, she now understood with a force that struck her somewhere between her sternum and her spine, was no simple man at all. It was a man desperately, achingly, secretly in love, and that terrified her more than anything the Wild West had thrown at her yet. She had come to Harlan County, Kansas in the spring of 1882 with 2 trunks of belongings, a head full of Eastern education, and a heart so thoroughly broken by a man back in Philadelphia that she had been genuinely convinced the organ had lost its purpose. She had come because her late uncle had left her 40 acres of flat, stubborn, beautiful land, and because land, unlike men, did not make promises it did not intend to keep. She had not come for this. She had not come for Bernard Sullivan standing in her doorway with his confession hanging between them like smoke from a distant fire, visible and undeniable and impossible to ignore. "You could have fixed it permanently on the first visit," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the one mercy the moment offered her. Bernard Sullivan did not flinch. He was not a man given to flinching. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with the kind of quiet steadiness that the frontier seemed to produce in the men who actually belonged to it, who had not merely arrived at it seeking fortune, but had grown from it like the tough prairie grass that survived drought and fire, and still came back green every spring. He had been born 40 miles east of where they now stood, the son of an Irish immigrant blacksmith and a Kansas woman who had outlasted 3 hard winters before the 4th one finally took her. He knew what endurance looked like. He wore it in the set of his jaw and the patience behind his eyes. "I know," he said simply. Those 2 words undid something in Effie Covington that 4 months of weekly visits had been quietly working loose. She had arrived in Harlan County on a Tuesday morning in late April, stepping off a wagon that smelled of horse and dust and sun-baked wood, squinting against the relentless Kansas sky that seemed to go on in every direction, until it became the sky of some other, larger world entirely. The town of Caldwell was 12 miles to the east, close enough to reach by horse in a reasonable morning, far enough that she felt genuinely, exhilaratingly alone on her 40 acres in a way she had never felt in the crowded, gaslit streets of Philadelphia. Her Uncle Horace had maintained the property for 7 years before his heart gave out in the summer of 1881, and he had kept it well enough that the main house was solid, the well was good, and the small barn held 4 chickens and a mule named Augustus, who regarded Effie with the specific disdain that mules reserved for people they had not chosen. Everything else was a project. The fence line needed mending in 3 places. The root cellar door had warped and required lifting before it would open. And the front door latch, which Effie discovered on her very first night alone on the property, was so loose as to be essentially decorative, offering a psychological suggestion of security rather than any actual physical fact of it. She had gone to Caldwell on her second day, not to find a husband, not to find a community, though both were offered to her with the aggressive enthusiasm of a frontier town that understood the value of eligible women, but to find a hardware store and the particular kind of thin-threaded bolt that she believed would solve the latch problem. What she had found instead, standing behind the counter of Macready's General and Hardware with a level in his left hand, and a calm expression that somehow communicated both competence and zero interest in performing it for anyone, was Bernard Sullivan. He was the town's general repairman, she learned, a man who could fix anything from a wagon axle to a busted flue, who charged fair prices and always showed up when he said he would and never made you feel foolish for not having been able to manage the repair yourself. He was, according to Mrs. Patricia Doyle, who ran the boarding house and who seemed constitutionally unable to let anyone stand at a counter in Caldwell without being educated about their surroundings, the most reliable man in 3 counties and also, in Mrs. Doyle's specifically weighted opinion, the most obstinately unmarried. Not for lack of trying on the part of half the county, Mrs. Doyle had confided, leaning close enough that Effie could smell lavender water and something that might have been whiskey. He is simply not interested, does his work, goes home, keeps his own company, polite as you please to everyone and close as a locked box to everyone the same. Effie had thanked Mrs. Doyle and purchased her bolt and ridden home on Augustus and fixed the latch herself, because she was perfectly capable of fixing latches and had no intention of becoming one of those frontier women who required a man for every minor mechanical emergency. The latch had held for exactly 6 days. On the 7th day, a Tuesday, she had come back from checking the east fence line to find Bernard Sullivan standing on her porch with his toolbox, his hat in his hand, and an expression of professional neutrality so perfectly maintained that she could not have told you whether he was pleased to be there or merely fulfilling an obligation. "Mrs. Doyle mentioned you taken on the old Covington place," he said, because of course Mrs. Doyle had mentioned it. Mrs. Doyle mentioned everything to everyone as a matter of civic philosophy. "Thought I'd stop by, see if there was anything that needed looking at." "I'm Miss Covington," Effie had said, "and the latch is loose again." He had looked at the latch, then at her, then at the latch again with the focused attention of a man who was seeing something he found genuinely interesting. "Bolt stripped," he said. "Threads too worn. I'll need to replace the whole mechanism." He had replaced the whole mechanism. It had taken him 20 minutes and a cup of coffee that Effie had felt obligated to offer, and he had accepted with evident appreciation. He had told her, in response to her questions, that the property was sound, that the well was one of the better ones in the county, and that Augustus the mule had a reputation for stubbornness that preceded him considerably. He had taken no money for the repair. He had tipped his hat and left. On the following Tuesday, the latch was loose again. She had been annoyed initially, then puzzled. She had examined the mechanism herself, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over problems she was determined to solve without assistance, and she could see no obvious reason why a newly replaced latch should already be failing. She had considered that perhaps the Kansas weather was harder on hardware than she had accounted for, or that the door frame itself had some subtle warp that created irregular stress on the mechanism. She had considered these things and found them plausible enough to excuse, and had accepted Bernard Sullivan's second visit with the same practical gratitude she would have extended to any competent tradesman who showed up reliably and charged nothing. He had come every Tuesday for 4 months, and in those 4 months, something had happened to Effie Covington that she had been absolutely certain was no longer possible. She had started looking forward to Tuesdays. Not because of the latch, not because of any pressing need for repairs, though Bernard always found something useful to do even if the latch itself held for once. A loose board on the porch step replaced. A window frame resealed against the prairie wind. A problem with Augustus's water trough that he solved with remarkable efficiency and minimum complaint from Augustus, who reserved his complaints for Effie specifically. She had started looking forward to Tuesdays because of the conversation, the slow, careful, genuine conversation that happened over coffee in her small kitchen, while Bernard told her things about the land and the town, and the county that she genuinely needed to know. And she told him things about herself that she had not fully intended to share but found herself sharing anyway, because there was something about his attentiveness that made dishonesty feel more effortful than truth. She had told him about Philadelphia, about the sisters she had left behind, about the teaching position she had held at a girls' school that had been satisfying in a way she could not entirely explain without sounding either earnest or foolish. She had not told him about the man in Philadelphia, about the engagement that had ended with a letter rather than a conversation, with the particular cruelty of a man who had decided her 40 Kansas acres and her dead uncle's modest legacy did not make her interesting enough to retain. She had not told Bernard that, and she had been surprised to discover that she wanted to, and she had been even more surprised to discover that the wanting frightened her, because she had come to Kansas specifically to put herself beyond the reach of the kind of pain that wanting something led to. She had come to be self-sufficient, competent, independent. She had come to be alone in a way that felt like a choice rather than a wound. And now here was Bernard Sullivan on a Tuesday morning in August, the air outside already thick with the kind of heat that made the prairie shimmer and dance at the edges of your vision. And he had just told her the truth that rearranged everything. "I know," he had said, about the fact that he could have fixed the latch permanently on that first visit. And Effie Covington, who had survived a broken engagement and a cross-country move, and 4 months of frontier hardship with her composure substantially intact, found that 2 words from this particular man had the power to shake her in ways that none of those previous events had managed. "How long?" she asked, and her voice had dropped to something quieter now, something that was not quite angry and not quite afraid and not quite pleased, but contained some unmeasurable part of all three. "Have you known? Known that I wanted a reason to come by?" He tilted his head just slightly, and she saw something move across his face that she had not seen in 4 months of Tuesday mornings, something that was not the calm professional neutrality she had catalogued and categorized, but something raw underneath it, something that had been there the whole time behind the locked box Mrs. Doyle had described. "Since about 10 minutes into our first conversation." Effie released the doorframe and stepped back, because she needed the space. She needed the dimensional reality of her own kitchen around her, the familiar shapes of her cast iron stove and her modest table, and the 3 books she had brought from Philadelphia stacked on the windowsill, because she refused to be without books even in the middle of Kansas. She moved to the stove and lifted the coffee pot because her hands needed something to do, because idle hands in a moment like this would betray her absolutely. "You should have said something," she said, and she heard the contradiction in it even as she said it, heard the way she was accusing him of a dishonesty that she herself had been equally practicing, because she had known, somewhere beneath the practical logic of Tuesday visits and broken latches, that she looked forward to his arrival in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with home repair. "I didn't think you'd welcome it," he said, and he had not moved from the doorway, had not stepped uninvited into her space, and that restraint told her something about him that the 4 months of Tuesday visits had been building toward telling her all along. "You came here alone. You made it very clear you intended to stay alone. I respected that. But you kept coming. I kept coming because I could not." He said it simply, without dramatic decoration, and simplicity in a declaration of that magnitude was somehow more devastating than poetry would have been. "And because every time I came, you seemed a little more glad to see me than the time before, and I told myself that was enough." That it was enough just to sit in your kitchen and drink your coffee and know you were all right. Effie set the coffee pot down and turned to face him, and she made herself look at him properly, the way she had carefully avoided looking at him in the way that she had been avoiding for weeks now, the full examination that her honest self had been postponing. He was still standing in the doorway. The Kansas sun was behind him, turning the edges of his dark hair to something that approached warmth, and his hat was in his hands and his expression was braced, patient, already resigned to whatever she decided, and that readiness to receive her rejection quietly, without performance or resentment, was the thing that finally broke through the last careful wall Effie Covington had built around herself in the wreckage of Philadelphia. "Come in," she said, "and sit down. And tell me everything you have not told me in 4 months." The look on his face then, the specific quality of it, the careful restraint of a man who was not permitting himself to hope too quickly or too much. She thought about that look for the rest of her life and never tired of it. He came in. He sat down. And they talked for 3 hours, the longest continuous conversation two people can have who are really, underneath the words, saying something entirely different, something that requires the words to work up to but cannot be contained by them. He told her about his mother, who had taught him to make a proper coffee and to take care of the things worth taking care of and not to make a fuss about the difficulty of either. He told her about his father, the blacksmith from County Clare who had crossed an ocean because Ireland had run out of promises and Kansas at least had space enough for a man to find his own footing. He told her about the winter of 1876, when he had been 25, and the weather had come down so hard and so cold that 3 families in the county had not survived it, and how that winter had taught him that survival was not the same as living, and that he had spent the 6 years since then working very hard at survival without having quite managed to put his hand on the thing that made it living. He did not say that meeting Effie Covington had put his hand on it. He did not need to, because she had already understood. She told him about Philadelphia, and she told him about the man, whose name was Cornelius Hartfield and who had been wealthy and elegant and entirely the wrong kind of person for someone like Effie, which she had understood intellectually long before she understood it in the way that actually mattered, in the way that reorganized your life around it. She told Bernard that Cornelius had wanted a particular kind of woman, and she had spent 2 years attempting to be that woman and had failed at it thoroughly, and had been devastated by the failure in the way you are devastated by something you wanted badly enough to compromise yourself for, and then lost anyway. She told him that coming to Kansas had felt like giving up but had turned out to feel like waking up, and she told him that she had not been prepared for the possibility of a man who saw the version of her that did not compromise, who kept coming back specifically for that version. "That is the only version of you I have ever met," Bernard said, with a directness that made her throat close slightly. "I know," she said. "That's the point." Outside, Augustus the mule made a noise that was approximately his opinion of the afternoon heat, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was working through its full repertoire, with the dedicated enthusiasm of a creature who understood the value of making itself known, and the August sun moved through its arc with its usual indifference to human emotional events, and Effie Covington sat across a kitchen table from Bernard Sullivan and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that was the opposite of devastation. It was not the breathless, consuming, slightly frantic feeling she remembered from her early months with Cornelius Hartfield, that feeling that had turned out to be anxiety dressed up as romance, the constant low-grade terror of being insufficient for the thing she was trying to be. This was different. This was the feeling of being seen by someone who was not waiting for you to be better or different, who was simply, steadily, completely attentive to the actual person in front of him. It was quieter than what she had felt before. It was also, she understood with a certainty that was itself new, considerably more real. "I need you to know," she said carefully, because she was a precise woman who believed in the importance of precision when it mattered most, "that I came here to be independent, That is not a temporary position I intend to abandon. I know it isn't, he said, and I need you to know that what happened in Philadelphia taught me to be very careful about the difference between what someone offers and what they intend. Those two things are not always the same. No, he agreed. They are not. He met her eyes directly, the way he always did, with the particular steady honesty she had noticed from the first day and catalogued without understanding, without being willing to let herself understand. I will tell you plainly what I intend, if that is useful. It is. I intend to be honest with you. I intend to repair your latch properly today, so that it does not give me an excuse to come back next Tuesday, because I would rather come back next Tuesday as someone you have invited than someone who has manufactured a reason. He paused, and she could see him choosing his next words with the same care she gave her own, and that deliberateness moved her in a way she had not anticipated. I would like to court you properly, Miss Covington, if you are willing to be courted, with your full knowledge of what I am doing and why. No hidden motives, no false pretenses. Effie looked at this man in her kitchen, this man who had come every Tuesday for 4 months and fixed her latch and drunk her coffee, and told her the true things about the land and the county and himself. This man who had just confessed to manufacturing proximity out of love, and had simultaneously offered to stop the deception the moment he admitted it. And she understood that she was at a genuine crossroads of a kind that the geography of Kansas had taught her to recognize. The kind where the right road was not necessarily the comfortable one, but was recognizable by its clarity. Yes, she said, you may court me properly, Mr. Sullivan, and please do fix that latch permanently. I cannot abide deception in any form, including from hardware. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she had been cataloging for 4 months without letting herself acknowledge that she cataloged it. The half-smile that was his full smile if you knew him well enough to recognize it. And she realized with a start that she knew him that well already, that 4 months of Tuesday mornings had made her fluent in a language she had not known she was learning. He fixed the latch that afternoon with a thoroughness that suggested he was making a point, using a heavier mechanism and longer screws driven deep into solid wood, the kind of repair that would outlast the house around it. When he was done, he showed her the finished work with the same quiet pride he took in all his work, not boastful but genuine, and she tested it 3 times and admitted it was solid, and they both understood that the broken latch had served its purpose and could be retired with honor. He came back the following Tuesday. He was invited. The courtship of Effie Covington and Bernard Sullivan proceeded with a quality that could only be described as appropriate to both of them, which was to say it was honest and patient and occasionally contentious in the way that 2 genuinely intelligent people are sometimes contentious, because they both have strong opinions, and neither is inclined to surrender one without proper cause. Their first real disagreement came in September, when the question of how Effie intended to manage the East 40 acres for the coming season became a point of genuine dispute. She had been planning to leave it fallow, reasoning that the soil needed recovery time after her uncle's years of wheat. Bernard, who knew the county's soil cycles with the intimacy of a man who had paid attention to them his entire life, felt that the East field-specific composition would benefit from a cover crop of winter rye, which would restore the nitrogen the wheat had depleted, while also providing some protection against the topsoil erosion that the January winds routinely produced. Effie had listened to this argument with her arms crossed and her expression attentive, had asked 3 sharp follow-up questions that demonstrated she had been listening precisely, and had then pointed out that she had spent the summer reading every agricultural pamphlet she could get from Caldwell, including those published by the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan, and that the recommendations therein supported her fallow theory. Bernard had then produced, from his coat pocket with the calm preparation of a man who had anticipated this exchange, a letter from a soil scientist he had corresponded with in Topeka, who had done specific work on the county's northwestern field compositions, and whose conclusions aligned with the winter rye position. They had stood in the east field in the September afternoon arguing about soil science, with the focused intensity of two people who were actually arguing about something else entirely, about trust and authority, and the specific question of whether Effie Covington's sovereignty over her own 40 acres was something Bernard Sullivan respected in practice as well as in principle. He had recognized it before she had articulated it. "This is your land," he had said, stopping in the middle of a sentence about nitrogen cycles. "Whatever you decide, I will help you with it." And she had looked at him for a long moment, this man who had just conceded not because he believed himself wrong, but because he understood that the argument was not purely about agriculture, and she had felt the last careful tension in her spine release just slightly. "Plant the winter rye," she had said. "And if it works, you may feel quietly smug about it until spring. If it does not work, you may not mention the soil scientist from Topeka again." "Agreed," he had said, with the half-smile that was his full smile. The winter rye worked beautifully. By October they were walking together in the evenings, a ritual that had begun practically, as a way for Bernard to check the fence lines before dusk, and had evolved into something that had very little to do with fence lines. The Kansas autumn came in gold and rust, the prairie grass turning colors that Effie had not expected from a landscape she had arrived prepared to find monotonous, had spent a whole July revising her initial opinion of as the light shifted, and the seasons began to move through the land with a drama she had never witnessed growing up in the relative landscape certainty of Pennsylvania. They talked on those walks endlessly, the way two people talk when they have discovered that the other person is someone who actually listens, a rarer quality than it ought to be in any century. He told her about the county's history, about the cattle drives that had run through Caldwell in the years before the quarantine lines pushed them west, about the specific complicated quality of life along the border between Kansas and Indian Territory, a border that was both a legal line on a map and a living, contested, difficult reality for the people on both sides of it. He told her about the Cheyenne families he had known as a boy, whose camp had been 15 miles north, and with whom his father had traded honestly, and who had treated Bernard with the specific grace that people extend to children who demonstrate genuine curiosity rather than fear. He told her about watching that world be systematically reduced, the land taken, the agreements broken, the people moved and moved and moved again, and he told her with the kind of anger that is quiet because it is too large and too long-standing to express loudly. Effie listened to this with her full attention, and with something that was close to grief, the specific grief of a person who has lived in a world of abstract injustice, and is now being shown its specific human weight, the individual names and faces that the large historical forces had moved through and not cared about the moving. She had grown up in a Philadelphia household that considered itself enlightened on matters of justice and had produced opinions on many topics from a comfortable distance, and Kansas was teaching her, in the patient way that only proximity teaches, the difference between having correct opinions and actually understanding what the opinions were about. "Did you ever speak about it?" she asked him one evening as the sky went amber and then rose above the prairie, the colors so vivid they seemed to belong to a painting rather than an actual atmosphere, to anyone who might have changed anything. "I wrote letters," he said, "to the Kansas legislature, to the Department of the Interior." "I am not the only one who wrote letters." He was quiet for a moment. "Letters are words. Words are not enough, but they are what I had to send." "Words are not nothing," Effie said firmly, because she believed this with the conviction of someone whose primary relationship with the world had always been conducted through language. "They are the beginning of things." He had looked at her, then with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when she said something that surprised him into complete attention, and the warmth of that look, directed at her fully and without reservation, had made the amber prairie sky seem brighter. November came with its particular edge, the wind off the open plain carrying the first genuine cold, and Caldwell came alive with the preparations that frontier communities make against winter, with the focused energy of people who know from experience what insufficient preparation costs. Effie had begun to know the town properly by then, the rhythms and personalities of it, the way information moved through it via Mrs. Doyle with the efficiency of a telegraph system and the inevitable embellishment of a novelist, the way the Saturday afternoon market had a social function entirely distinct from its commercial one, the way community was not an abstract value in a place like this, but a practical survival strategy that everyone participated in because the alternative was failing alone. She had begun to be known, too, which was a different and more complex experience than knowing. She was the Covington woman, the Eastern schoolteacher, Horace's niece, the one who had shown up alone and was apparently intending to stay, which the community had first regarded with the mixture of admiration and skepticism that had extended to any lone woman attempting the frontier, and which had gradually shifted to something warmer as Effie demonstrated, consistently and without drama, that she was exactly as capable as she had come here intending to be. She had also, by November, become unmistakably Bernard Sullivan's particular interest, which Mrs. Doyle had communicated to every interested party in 3 counties with barely restrained delight, because Mrs. Doyle had spent several years considering Bernard Sullivan's emotional isolation a personal affront to the romantic possibilities of Harlan County, and was intensely gratified to see him rectifying the situation. "He is different with you," Mrs. Doyle told Effie one Saturday morning in October, in the tone of a woman who considers this information a gift. "I have known that man for 15 years, and I have never seen him look at a person the way he looks at you." "And how is that?" Effie had asked, because she was a precise woman who preferred to deal in specific information. "Like you are the answer to a question he has been asking his whole life," Mrs. Doyle said, with the simple sureness of a woman who had been watching human beings pair up and come apart for decades, and had developed reliable instincts about which was which. Effie had gone home on Augustus that morning, turning that description over in her mind like a stone you find in a riverbed that is more interesting than it appeared at first look, holding it up to different angles of light, discovering that its qualities were perhaps genuinely what they appeared to be rather than what anxiety or history or caution told you to assume. He asked her formally in December, standing in her kitchen after they had spent the afternoon checking the root cellar stores and making sure the main house was properly sealed against what looked to be a hard winter coming. He had been completely serious in the way he was completely serious about things that mattered, without theatrical preamble or excessive decoration, the words themselves carrying the weight of what he meant by them. Effie. He had used her given name by then, and she his, the transition from the formal address having happened somewhere in October, without either of them marking the exact moment, which seemed right for something of that kind. "I would like to ask you to marry me, not because the frontier requires a woman to have a husband, and not because I think you cannot manage this land and this life without one. You have made it perfectly clear that you can and you will. I am asking because I want to be in your life the way that marriage means, as your partner and your companion and your person, if you will have me." There was not a single hidden motive in any part of that speech. She would have detected it immediately if there had been. "Yes," said Effie Covington, who had come to Kansas to be independent and had discovered that independence and love were not, in fact, mutually exclusive provided you found the right person to love. "I will have you, Bernard Sullivan." They were married in February of 1883 in the Caldwell Community Church, on a day when the Kansas sky was a particular shade of clear, deep blue that seemed to go on forever above the white-covered prairie, and the world was cold and bright and absolutely still, and the whole congregation, which was to say most of the county, witnessed Bernard Sullivan look at Effie Covington when she came through the church door in her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had brought from Philadelphia in a moment of optimism she had not understood as optimism at the time, and the look on his face was the one Mrs. Doyle had described, and it was entirely real, and everyone in the church saw it, and several people, including Mrs. Doyle herself, had to make use of their handkerchiefs. Effie looked back at him with an expression that was, for anyone who knew her as well as Bernard did, the equivalent of a declaration in any language, the expression of a woman who had made a precise and deliberate choice and was entirely at peace with it, which on Effie Covington's face was as close to radiant happiness as radiant happiness ever got. The words of the ceremony were spoken and witnessed, and Bernard Sullivan put a simple gold band on Effie Sullivan's finger with the careful hands he put to everything he valued, and they were married, and the congregation sang something appropriate, and Mrs. Doyle's handkerchief was entirely saturated, and Augustus the mule, who was waiting outside with a patience that did not reflect his usual relationship to patients, registered no opinion on the event whatsoever. The early months of their marriage had the quality of a good sentence falling into place, the satisfaction of two things that belong together finding their proper arrangement. They were not easy months, because the frontier was not an easy environment and winter in Kansas tested everyone. But they were months in which Effie understood the full meaning of what Bernard had said about survival versus living, because she had been surviving Kansas, and now she was living in it, in the specific warmth of a shared life that made the cold outside mean something different. They were well matched in the ways that mattered for a life together in that time and place, which were practical as well as romantic. Effie's education and precision with figures meant that the property accounts were kept with a clarity her uncle had not managed, and she began to apply her teaching instincts to understanding the agricultural cycles of the land, with a systematic thoroughness that Bernard found both impressive and occasionally amusing. Bernard's knowledge of the land and its requirements, his physical capability for the hard labor of the frontier, and his deep network of relationships throughout the county were assets that benefited them both. They were also well matched in the ways that mattered simply because they were two people who loved each other, which occasionally expressed itself as argument and occasionally as laughter and very frequently as the specific pleasure of being known by someone who finds you interesting rather than just familiar. In the spring of 1883, Effie discovered she was going to have a child, and she sat with this information for 2 days before she told Bernard, not because she was uncertain about his response, but because she was uncertain about her own. She had not come to Kansas planning for this. She had not planned for any of it, for the Latch or the Tuesday mornings or the man who fixed things, and yet here she was, 17 months after arriving alone on 40 acres of flat Kansas land, sharing those acres with a husband and now expecting to share them with someone new entirely. She told him on a Tuesday morning because Tuesdays had remained their specific day, the day they treated as separate from the regular calendar, drinking coffee in the kitchen where it had all started, and she told him plainly and directly in the way she told him everything. The look on his face was not what she had expected. She had expected happiness, and happiness was there, but underneath it was something else, something open and unguarded that she had never seen on him before, a kind of wonder that made him look, just for a moment, much younger than 31. "Effie," he said, and could not seem to find any other words, which was remarkable in a man who was generally precise with language. "I know," she said, which is what he had said to her on the doorstep 8 months before, and the echo of it hung between them warm and deliberate, and she watched him understand the echo and watched something in him fill up with it. He reached across the kitchen table and took her hand, carefully, with the same care he gave to everything worth taking care of, and they sat for a long time in the morning light coming through the Kansas windows, while Augustus communicated his opinions about breakfast from the direction of the barn. The pregnancy was managed with the practical approach that Effie brought to every challenge, combined with the attentive worry that Bernard brought to everything involving Effie's well-being, which occasionally required negotiation. He had a tendency, she discovered, to be protective in ways that occasionally overestimated the fragility of a woman who had survived a Philadelphia winter in an unheated apartment and a Kansas summer on a horse. And she had a tendency to underestimate, out of pride, the genuine physical demands of a Kansas pregnancy in the 1880s. And between these two tendencies, they found a workable middle ground that involved her doing as much as she reasonably could and him worrying about it quietly rather than loudly. Doc Halliday in Caldwell, who was not the famous one but was a perfectly competent medical man with 30 years of frontier practice behind him, declared her progress excellent and delivered them, on a November morning in 1883, a son. Bernard Sullivan held his son with the same careful hands he held everything worth holding, and looked down at him with an expression that made Effie, who had just done the considerable physical work of introducing the child to the world, and was therefore entitled to look however she liked, think about every Tuesday morning and every fixed latch and every cup of coffee and every walk along the east fence line, the whole chain of small, ordinary, specific events that had brought her to this particular moment in a Kansas bedroom in the winter of 1883, holding the evidence of a life she had not planned and could not now imagine having missed. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Bernard looked up from his son's face. "Whatever you think," he said, which was partly genuine deference and partly the dazed quality of a man who had been awake for 18 hours attending his wife through labor and was currently operating primarily on love and strong coffee. "I was thinking William," Effie said, "for your father." Bernard's father, William Sullivan the blacksmith from County Clare, had died in 1879, and Bernard spoke of him with the specific reverence of a man who understood what he had lost. The expression on Bernard Sullivan's face at that moment was something Effie could never quite describe to anyone who asked, and people asked, because it was the kind of expression that people noticed and wanted to understand. It was gratitude and love and grief all together, the grief making the love heavier and more real in the way that grief sometimes does. "William," he said, testing the name the way you test solid ground before you trust your weight to it. "Yes, William Sullivan." William Sullivan was a vigorous and determined child who took after his mother in intelligence and his father in stubbornness, a combination that created interesting dynamics from very early on. He was fascinated by tools before he could walk and by books shortly after, a pairing that delighted both his parents for different reasons, and suggested he might grow up to be the kind of person who could both build a thing and explain precisely why he had built it. Effie resumed her full management of the property within weeks of his birth, with adaptations for the reality of an infant, and did not experience this as deprivation, but as the particular satisfaction of a woman doing exactly what she had chosen to do in the life she had chosen, which included both the child and the 40 Kansas acres and the husband and the mule, all of them parts of a complete picture she would not have reduced by any element. She had begun, by 1884, to write. Not for publication initially, just for herself, the careful recording of observations about the land and the seasons and the life of the frontier that her teaching-trained mind required to fully process experience. She wrote about the particular quality of a Kansas spring after a hard winter, the way the land came back with what seemed like indecent haste, the prairie flowers pushing through ground that had been iron-hard 3 weeks before. She wrote about the community of Caldwell and the complicated, layered, fundamentally human quality of life in a frontier town, the generosity and the gossip and the genuine mutual dependence that made neighbors into something closer than neighbors. She wrote, in her most careful and most private entries, about Bernard, about the specific experience of being known and loved by someone who had chosen you not for who you could be made into, but for who you actually were, and how that experience was both simpler and larger than anything the romantic literature she had grown up on had suggested it would be. Bernard, who respected her privacy absolutely, and would no more have read her journal without invitation than he would have fixed a latch without cause, knew that she was writing and was glad of it, because he understood that writing was how Effie processed the world into something she could carry, and he wanted her to be able to carry it. She sent a piece to the Kansas Farmer newspaper in Topeka in the summer of 1884, a practical article about soil management practices for small eastern Kansas holdings that was informed by 4 seasons of observation on their own 40 acres, and by the correspondence she had established with the agricultural scientists Bernard had introduced her to. The piece was published. Several readers wrote to the newspaper requesting more from the same author. The editor wrote to Effie and asked if she had more. She did. By 1885, she was a regular contributor to the Kansas Farmer and had also begun corresponding with a women's agricultural cooperative in Newton that was attempting to establish support networks for women managing land independently or alongside husbands who recognized the value of a fully informed partner. She had found her professional identity in Kansas, the one that was hers entirely, and that existed alongside her marriage rather than being consumed by it. Bernard read every piece she published with the focused attention he gave to things he considered important, which was the same attention he gave to fence lines and soil quality and the structural integrity of well-built things. And he was proud of her in a way that was not possessive pride, but the genuine admiration of a person who sees someone they love doing exactly what they are made to do. In the late spring of 1885, they had occasion to return to the question of the front door latch, which had held perfectly for 2 years and 3 months, and was, to the immense credit of Bernard's original repair, still solid and functional, and giving no indication of requiring attention. This occasion arose because Effie was repainting the front door, which she had decided needed a fresh coat of deep red paint, because she had read an article in a Cincinnati home magazine that Mrs. Doyle had acquired through unclear channels, and she had removed the latch hardware to paint properly behind it, and Bernard had caught her in the act, and they had stood together looking at the old latch mechanism with the specific shared knowledge of what it represented. "I should have fixed it properly the first time," he said, and he was not apologizing but revisiting, the way you revisit a thing that turned out all right with the understanding that it might not have. "You did fix it properly," Effie said. "Eventually, she handed him the hardware, put it back when the paint is dry, and do it properly." "I always do things properly," he said mildly. "You fixed that latch incorrectly for 4 months. I fixed the latch precisely as it needed to be fixed for 4 months. The result was proper." She had looked at him with the expression she reserved for arguments she was losing on a technicality, which was the one where her mouth did the thing it did when she was resisting a smile, and he had looked back at her with the half-smile that was his full smile, and they had been 2 people in the complete understanding of a shared story that belonged only to them. The second pregnancy came in 1886, and this time Effie had carried it with slightly less anxiety, having one successful experience to draw on and a community of women around her who had accumulated between them enough practical knowledge to advise on every stage of the process. Doc Halliday declared her progress excellent once more, which seemed to be his professional catchphrase, and in January of 1887 they welcomed a daughter. Effie named her Clara, which was her mother's name, the mother who had died when Effie was 14 and whose loss had shaped her in ways she was still sometimes surprised to discover. Bernard held Clara with the same careful hands and the same particular expression, and William, who was 3 and very serious about his role as the eldest, regarded his sister with the concentrated focus of someone taking on a significant responsibility. The homestead had grown by then, not dramatically but steadily, in the way that genuine effort applied consistently to good land grows things. They had a milk cow named Patience who more than earned her name, and the chicken count had risen to 9 from the original 4, and they had planted a kitchen garden in 1884 that had become, over 3 seasons, one of the most productive small gardens in the county, Effie having applied her systematic mind to the project with predictable results. The 40 acres were fully productive, the East Field's winter rye rotation having been quietly vindicated multiple seasons running, a fact that Bernard had indeed felt quietly smug about until spring with absolute reliability, and which Effie acknowledged with the grace of a woman who was right about most things and could afford to be wrong about some of them. The community of Caldwell and the surrounding county had changed around them in those years, the way frontier communities change with a particular rapidity that feels historical even as you are living through it. The cattle trade had shifted further west with the quarantine lines, and some of the rougher element that the cattle drives had brought through the area had moved with it, leaving Caldwell a somewhat quieter and more settled town than it had been in Effie's first years. New families were arriving from the east as the railroads made the journey more accessible, and Effie found herself sometimes in the unusual position of being an established resident offering advice to newcomers, which was a turn of identity she had not anticipated, and that amused her enormously. She had been the newcomer. She had been the Eastern woman who everyone was watching to see whether she would last. She had lasted and had grown roots and was now, unambiguously, of this place in the way that happens when you love something long enough to be changed by it, when the relationship becomes reciprocal. Bernard noticed this in her with the attention he paid to all gradual and important changes, the way a good farmer notices the season turning not in the dramatic moments, but in the accumulated small shifts that precede them. She moved differently on the land than she had in April of 1882. She knew it differently, felt it differently, responded to its signals with the instinct that only time and attention build. She was a Kansas woman now, without having ceased to be the precise, educated, particular person she had always been, and the combination of the two was, to Bernard's honest private estimation, remarkable. He told her so one evening in the early autumn of 1887, when William was almost 4 and Clara was 8 months old, and they were sitting on the porch in the last good warmth of the season, the sky going through its nightly performance of colors above the prairie, with the same lavish indifference to any audience that the Kansas sky always had. He told her simply and directly, the way he told her everything, that she was the most remarkable person he had ever known, and that he considered it the significant achievement of his life to have found a reason to come by. Effie had laughed at that, the specific laugh that was her full laugh, the one she had not produced readily in her first months in Kansas, and had become increasingly willing to produce as the years went by, a genuine and unguarded sound that she had stopped feeling self-conscious about somewhere in the second year of their marriage. "A broken latch," she said. "A broken latch," he confirmed. "And a woman who was so determined to be independent that she fixed it herself before I could get to it and then found it broken again the next week. You were breaking it yourself. I was ensuring it required attention. That is a very delicate way to describe deliberate deception. It is the most delicate form of deception I have ever practiced," he said, "and I am not sorry for it." She had reached across the space between their porch chairs and taken his hand, the way she had a particular habit of reaching for him when words felt like too much effort and touch was more direct, and they had sat in the comfortable silence of two people who had earned it together, listening to the prairie wind in the grass and the sounds of the land settling into evening, and Clara making the small sounds she made when she was drifting toward sleep in her crib inside. And it had been one of those moments that you cannot plan or manufacture, that only arrive as the product of a long accumulation of honest choices. The autumn of 1887 brought with it an event that shook Harlan County in a way that tested the community in the specific way communities are tested, at the level of their actual values rather than their expressed ones. A dispute over land boundaries between two cattle operations to the north escalated in the way such disputes escalated in that era, and in that place, badly, with the specific friction that occurs when men with guns and legal ambiguity and wounded pride occupy the same geography. The trouble came close enough to Caldwell that several families in the county found themselves concerned about their property and their safety. Bernard handled this with the same quiet capability he handled everything. He was not a man of violence and had no interest in becoming one, but he was also not a man who would fail to protect his family and his land out of an excess of philosophical nicety. He talked to the county sheriff, a steady man named Arlen Webb, who Effie trusted on the evidence of consistent good judgment. He organized a meeting of the neighboring homesteaders to ensure everyone was informed and that no one was facing the situation in isolation, because isolation was what made people vulnerable, in the Wild West as in any other theater of human difficulty. Effie had attended that meeting, which had surprised some of the attending men and surprised none of the attending women, and had taken precise and useful notes on what was agreed and what was unresolved, and had followed up with 2 written communications to the county seat that helped clarify the legal boundaries in question, because she understood that the written record mattered, and she was good at creating clear ones. The dispute was resolved through legal channels by the end of October, the specific resolution being less important than the fact that it was resolved without anyone's blood being shed, which in that context and time counted as an unqualified success. Bernard came home from the final meeting on a Thursday evening and told Effie it was done, and she had put down the lamp she was reading by and said good, in the tone she used when she had been more worried than she had let herself show. He had noticed. He always noticed. He sat down beside her and said, "I know," the way he had said it on the doorstep 4 years before, and she had looked at him and said, "I know you know," and they had understood each other completely in the shorthand of a marriage that had been built on honesty and had therefore accumulated a private language of enormous precision. The years continued in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, but with the specific quality of difficulty that 2 capable people in a genuine partnership can navigate, because they are facing it together rather than in parallel. William started school in Caldwell in 1888, riding in with Bernard on Monday mornings with the serious expression of a boy who considered learning a professional undertaking, and who came home on Friday afternoons with enough questions to occupy the entire weekend, which his parents answered with varying degrees of expertise and equal degrees of genuine engagement. Clara, who had arrived in the world with a personality already clearly formed, was demonstrating by age 2 that she would not be a child who was easily managed, and that the combination of her father's patient stubbornness and her mother's precise determination was going to produce something that the local population of Caldwell should probably begin preparing for. Effie's writing had grown and changed with her. She had been offered a regular column in the Kansas Farmer, which she accepted, and she had begun to write about things beyond agriculture, about the experience of women on the frontier, about the particular negotiations of independence and partnership and community that defined life in a place like Harlan County in the 1880s. She wrote with the precision she had always had, and with the authority that only direct experience provides, and the column was read widely enough that she began to receive correspondence from women across the state and beyond, letters that often amounted to someone saying, in more or less direct terms, that she had written something they had not known they needed someone to write. She answered every letter. Bernard, who watched her do this at the kitchen table in the evenings while William and Clara provided ambient noise appropriate to their ages and personalities, thought it was one of the best things about her. This absolute commitment to the idea that a word written to someone was a word worth answering. In 1890, they found out they were expecting again, which surprised them both somewhat, Clara being 3 and the household already full of the specific productive chaos of 2 children on a working homestead. Effie processed this information with her usual 2-day private consideration, and then told Bernard on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, because some things are done in the place where they belong. Bernard's response this time was immediate and uncomplicated happiness, the wonder of 1883 having settled into something warmer and more permanent that expressed itself differently, but was not any smaller. He asked her how she was feeling. She said she was feeling fine and slightly exasperated at the timing, given that the East Field was about to need significant attention, and he had laughed, a full and genuine laugh, because this was entirely Effie and he loved her for it exactly. Their second son arrived in the first days of 1891, on a cold, clean morning when the Kansas sky was the particular deep blue of a hard winter, and they named him Thomas, for no family reason specifically, but because when Bernard said the name aloud in the delivery room, it sounded right to both of them in the way some names simply do, and rightness was a quality they had learned to trust. Thomas Sullivan was quieter than either of his siblings had been, a watchful child with large dark eyes like his father and his father's quality of stillness, the quality of a person who is always paying close attention even when they appear to be simply sitting. Effie found this quality deeply recognizable and slightly unnerving, as she had found it in Bernard the first time she had seen it, and for the same reason, because there is something inherently intimate about being watched by someone who is genuinely paying attention. William was 7 by then, already a person of considered opinions and careful observation, and he welcomed Thomas with the gravity of an eldest child who has taken on the role of elder sibling as a genuine responsibility. Clara, who was 4 and not inclined to gravity in any form, regarded Thomas with the specific competitive interest of a middle child, assessing a new variable in a dynamic she had previously mapped. Life on the homestead had by 1891 taken on the full texture of an established life, which is different from a beginning life in specific ways. The buildings were solid and well-maintained, a craft entirely owing to Bernard's consistent care and Effie's insistence on attending to small problems before they became large ones, a domestic philosophy she applied to physical structures with the same precision she applied to everything else. The East Field had become the North Field too, a careful expansion made possible by 4 years of good management and one excellent wet spring that had made the additional cultivation viable. Effie was 34 years old and Bernard was 39, and they were in the exact middle of their lives together, a point that neither of them could have named on any calendar, but that they both inhabited with the particular fullness of people who have chosen their lives deliberately and find themselves continuing to choose them every day. Mrs. Doyle had retired from active management of the boarding house in 1889, handing the operation to her niece with the absolute confidence of a woman who has trained a successor carefully, and had become what she had perhaps always been most suited to be, a person of the community in a purely social capacity, free to observe and comment and connect without the administrative demands of actually running anything. She had become something close to a grandmother figure to William and Clara, and then Thomas, arriving at the homestead several times a month with opinions on child-rearing that were welcome in proportion to how frequently Effie agreed with them, and managed the rest with diplomatic grace. It was Mrs. Doyle who noticed, in the spring of 1892, that Effie seemed tired in a specific way, and who said so with the directness that was her defining characteristic, and that Effie, by now, had learned to interpret correctly as care rather than intrusion. "You need a few days without the columns and the letters and the field accounts," Mrs. Doyle said, on a Tuesday morning in April when she had arrived at the homestead and found Effie at the kitchen table with 3 different correspondence projects underway simultaneously, and a quality around her eyes that spoke of too many late nights. "Bernard agrees with me." "I haven't asked Bernard," Effie said. "No, but I have. said Mrs. Doyle, with a serenity that made the admission of the conspiracy entirely comfortable. Bernard, when Effie found him and raised the subject with the brisk precision of a woman who would not be managed without her explicit participation in the managing, had looked at her with the steady attentiveness that was his primary language and said simply, "You have not slept past dawn in 3 months. I notice these things." "I have a column due," Effie said. "Write it Friday, take Thursday off." "That is not how a writing schedule works." "Thursday," he said, which was his way, when he had decided something was genuinely important, of saying it again without increasing the volume, and which Effie had learned over 9 years of marriage was the version of the argument she was probably going to lose, and that she should assess whether losing it was the catastrophe it initially appeared to be. It was not. She took Thursday. She spent it on the porch in the April warmth with a novel she had been meaning to read for 6 months, and William played in the yard with the focused self-direction of a child who has learned to occupy himself. And Clara brought her a slightly crushed wildflower from the prairie grass beyond the fence with the offering gravity of a 4-year-old. And Thomas slept in his basket in the mild spring air. And Bernard did not come out to check on her because he trusted her to rest, and also because he was fixing the water trough that Augustus had developed a new opinion about. And it was, all of it together, one of the finest days Effie Sullivan had ever spent on her 40 Kansas acres. She told Bernard this at dinner, in the easy domestic shorthand of a shared life. He said he was glad. She said it was possible that Mrs. Doyle and he were both occasionally right about things. He said he had always thought so. She threw a dinner roll at him with moderate accuracy, which surprised him into a laugh and sent William and Clara into the specific joy that children feel when their parents are being human together. The 1890s brought changes to Kansas, and to the West more broadly, that were felt in Harlan County, with the specific weight of historical forces arriving in a local place. The frontier era was closing, not dramatically but unmistakably, the wide-open quality of the land being replaced, mile by mile and county by county, with the more settled texture of an established agricultural region. This was in many ways what everyone who had homesteaded had worked toward, the transformation of difficult land into productive land. And in many ways it was also a loss, the particular wildness of the thing they had come to being replaced by something more orderly. Effie wrote about this in her column in 1893, about the specific melancholy and pride of watching something you had been part of building become something other than what it had been, about the way the frontier was simultaneously a period in history and a way of being that did not fully survive the period. It was one of the pieces she was proudest of in her years of writing, and Bernard read it at the kitchen table and looked up at her when he was done and said, "Yes," in the tone he used for things that said exactly what needed to be said. She had the piece reprinted later that year in 2 other publications, and received more correspondence from it than from anything she had previously written, correspondence that confirmed what she had suspected, that the experience she had tried to put into language was genuinely shared, which is the confirmation that any writer most hopes for. William turned 10 in 1893 and was already a reader of serious intention, working through everything in the small lending library the Caldwell School had acquired, and frequently requiring Bernard to make trips to Caldwell, and sometimes further for specific titles that William had learned of and needed. Clara was 6 and was attending school with an enthusiasm that manifested as returning home every day with strong opinions about what her teachers had explained incorrectly, which amused Effie and convinced her that Clara would either become a teacher herself or a formidable critic of them. Thomas was 2 and had begun to demonstrate that the watchful quality of his early months had been preliminary to something quite deliberate and specific, that he was a child who observed carefully before acting, and then acted with great precision, a quality that made him both the easiest and in some ways the most complex of the 3. In 1895, William was 12 and took up a position helping at Macready's Hardware after school on Fridays and Saturdays, which Macready, who had aged gracefully into a benevolent institution of the town, accepted with genuine pleasure, because William was precise and reliable and could do sums in his head. Bernard, looking at his son behind a hardware counter in the shop where he had stood himself 13 years before, felt something that was not quite emotion but contained all of it, the full accumulated weight of the life that had been lived between those two moments. He told Effie about the feeling that evening, and she had listened with her complete attention and then said, "Latches," with one word and the specific quality of voice that meant the whole story, and he had understood completely. In 1896, they planted the south field for the first time, completing what had become a full four-field rotation system that Effie had designed on paper over a winter, and Bernard had evaluated and approved with one suggested adjustment to the drainage pattern along the eastern border, which Effie had accepted on the merits. The south field in its first productive season yielded better than the most optimistic projection, and Effie, who had projected optimistically, was satisfied, and Bernard, who had projected somewhat more cautiously, was impressed, and they had celebrated with a dinner that Mrs. Doyle attended, and that William served with the gravity of a young man who had decided service was a skill worth mastering. Clara had her first experience of real heartbreak at 15, in 1901, involving a young man whose family had moved to the county from Missouri, and who had Clara's full attention for approximately 4 months before demonstrating, with the specific carelessness that young men sometimes demonstrate, that he did not merit it. Clara came home from this experience in the way people come home from their first genuine heartbreak, quietly and with dignity, which impressed Effie because her own first heartbreak had required considerably more processing, and they sat together in the kitchen where so many important conversations in the Sullivan household had been held, and Effie told her daughter the things that were true, that it hurt because it was real, that what hurt now would teach her what she actually needed, and that she was, categorically, worth more than someone who did not know what they had. Clara had listened to this with the attentiveness she brought to things she was genuinely taking in rather than politely hearing, and at the end of it she had said, "How did you know Papa was the right one?" Effie had thought about this carefully, the way she thought about things that deserved the full consideration. "He fixed my latch every week for 4 months because it gave him a reason to come by," she said. "And when I found out, he apologized for it and promised never to have a hidden motive again." "And he never has," she paused. "Find someone whose love looks like honesty, that is how you know." Clara had remembered this. Effie knew she had remembered it the way mothers know things, through the specific quality of the silence that follows important words when they land in the right place. William had, by 1902, finished the education that the county school provided and was working full-time at Macready's, which had expanded its operation to include a small machinery repair component that William had proposed and Macready had accepted. He was 19 years old, steady and quiet like his father, sharp and precise like his mother, and beginning to look at the world with the expression of a young man who is working out where he belongs in it. Effie watched him with the specific complicated pride of a mother who sees her child becoming himself, and finds the self he is becoming genuinely impressive. Bernard, at 50, had the quality that some men develop in middle age when they have spent their lives in honest labor and honest love, a quality of being entirely settled in themselves, without the unresolved edges that discontent produces. He was still the man who fixed things, who could be found on any given day attending to something that needed attention, on their own property or a neighbor's, with the same quiet competence and the same absolute refusal to do a job badly. He was also, by now, something of a county institution, not in the way of a famous person but in the way of a reliable one, someone people knew they could count on because he had demonstrated it repeatedly over 20 years. He and Effie had become, to the county, an institution of a different kind, the specific kind represented by a partnership so genuinely matched that people pointed to it the way people point to well-built structures, as evidence of what is possible when the foundation is right. This was not a role either of them had sought, and was one that both of them found slightly amusing, but they wore it with the same practical good humor they wore most things. Effie's writing had, over 2 decades, produced a body of work that extended well beyond the Kansas Farmer column, including 2 pamphlets on women's agricultural management that had been distributed by the Kansas State Agricultural College, and an ongoing correspondence with several women's organizations across the Midwest that were working on the questions of land rights and economic participation for frontier women that were the practical expression of the values she had always held. She was not famous, in any sense that the word implies widespread recognition. She was known, which is a more durable kind of recognition, known to the people for whom her work mattered, known in the specific communities where her words had made a difference, and known, most importantly, to the people who were her actual life, which was the community of Harlan County and the house with the well-fixed front latch and the 3 children who were becoming their own people, and the man who had fixed that latch every week for 4 months because he could not stay away. In 1903, Thomas, who was 12 and who had maintained his quality of watchful deliberation throughout his childhood in a way that had become his most recognizable characteristic, told his parents at dinner one evening that he was interested in medicine. He had arrived at this conclusion, he explained, with the systematic evidence that he had been paying attention to how Doc Halliday worked and reading the medical texts at the library in Caldwell, and had determined that the understanding of how bodies function and fail was the thing he found most consistently compelling. Bernard and Effie had listened to this with the full attention they gave to all 3 of their children when they were saying something important, and when Thomas was done, Effie had asked him 4 sharp questions about his reasoning, and Bernard had asked him 2 practical ones about the path forward, and Thomas had answered all 6 with the precision and calm of a 12-year-old who had thought this through extensively before announcing it. "We will find out what is required," Effie had said, meaning both the educational requirements and the financial ones, and Thomas had nodded with the gravity of someone who is keeping track of what he is being promised, and neither of his parents had any doubt that he would. Clara, who was 16 in 1903, and had fully recovered from the Missouri boy, and was engaged in a much more interesting and mutually respectful relationship with a young man named Peter Gaines, whose family had been in the county for 15 years, was paying attention to her younger brother with the specific look she had for things she found genuinely admirable, which was a look she did not distribute widely. The early years of the 20th century settled over Harlan County and over the Sullivan homestead with the particular quality of an era that knows itself to be transitional. The frontier, in any legal or geographical sense, was over. Kansas was a fully settled state with established institutions and a growing sense of itself as a permanent place rather than a temporary endeavor. The homesteaders who had survived and stayed had become, by this point, the older generation, the ones with the stories and the stakes in the ground and the 20-year-old buildings that were still solid because they had been built by people who intended to live in them. Effie was 45 in 1905, the year that Clara married Peter Gaines in the same Caldwell church where Effie and Bernard had been married 22 years before. Watching her daughter walk down that aisle with the specific combination of Clara's particular grace and the new quality of a young woman who has chosen deliberately, Effie felt the full accumulated weight of 22 years of a life that had turned out to be, in every way that mattered, the exact right life. Bernard, seated beside her, reached over and took her hand without looking away from Clara, and Effie held his hand the way she had been holding it for more than 2 decades, with the ease of something that has become as natural as breathing. And she thought about the Tuesday mornings and the broken latches and the cups of coffee in the small kitchen where everything had started, and she thought about the 40 Kansas acres, and the 3 children and the winter rye and Augustus, who had finally retired from active mule service in 1898 at an age that Doc Halliday estimated to be remarkable, and that Augustus himself seemed to regard as merely expected. And she thought about Mrs. Doyle, who was 80 years old and still in the front pew of every important event in Caldwell with her handkerchief at the ready. And she thought about the land and the seasons and the years and what it meant to belong to a place and to a person. She thought about how she had come here broken and armored and determined to need nothing and no one, and how the land and this man had between them made that determination unnecessary, not by overcoming it, but by demonstrating, with the patient evidence of accumulating years, that being genuinely loved by someone who saw you clearly was not the trap she had been taught to fear, but the thing she had always needed and deserved. "Are you all right?" Bernard asked quietly, because he had noticed her particular quality of stillness. "Completely," she said, which was the complete truth in every direction. William, at 22, was already an established figure in the Caldwell commercial community, having taken over from Macready when the old man retired in 1904 with genuine relief and absolute confidence in his successor. William ran Macready's, now Sullivan's Hardware and Machinery, with the precision and reliability that were his dual inheritance, and was beginning to court a young woman named Anne from a farming family in the eastern part of the county, who had Bernard's characteristic of genuine attentiveness and Effie's characteristic of absolute directness, and who therefore impressed both of his parents enormously. Thomas, at 14, had been corresponding with a physician in Topeka who had connections to the medical school in Kansas City, and who had looked at the systematic and carefully argued letter that Thomas had sent him, and responded with the opinion that the boy should absolutely pursue a medical education, and that he would be glad to help identify the pathway. Effie had been the one who wrote the response letter in cooperation with Thomas, both of them at the kitchen table, with their separate areas of precision, combining into something that the Topeka physician later described as the most organized communication he had received from a prospective medical student in 30 years of practice. By 1908, the Sullivan homestead had passed through the full cycle of what it had been built to be: a working farm, a family home, a place of consistent generation of the things that sustain life, both material and otherwise. Effie and Bernard were in their late 40s, their hair carrying some of the Kansas winters in it now, their faces marked by 25 years of outdoor work and laughter, and the particular quality of people who have spent a long time in each other's company and found it continually worthwhile. They had developed, over the years, a ritual that had grown naturally from the original Tuesday morning coffee, a daily morning conversation at the kitchen table before the day's demands arrived, an hour that was theirs specifically, in which the accumulated business of the house and the farm and the children was temporarily suspended in favor of the thing that had built all of it, their actual knowledge of and delight in each other. On a Tuesday morning in October of 1908, they were at the kitchen table when Effie looked up from her coffee and said, apropos of the 26 years that had accumulated between them, "You fixed that latch every week for 4 months." "I did," Bernard said, looking at her with the expression that was still, after all this time, the half-smile that was his full smile for those who knew him well enough to read it. "And I let you," she said. "I knew somewhere before I let myself know. I looked forward to Tuesdays before I could admit why." "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. They sat in the morning light of a Kansas autumn, with the sounds of the land around them and the solid presence of 26 years of a good life between them, and the front door latch, which Bernard had repaired on that August afternoon in 1882, with a thoroughness that had outlasted everything except the love that had prompted the original deception, held firm and solid in the door where it had always been. Thomas left for Kansas City and his medical education in the autumn of 1909, At 18, with his mother's systematic mind and his father's patient steadiness, and a trunk full of books, and a letter of introduction from the Topeka physician who had been as good as his word, Effie stood in the yard and watched the wagon carry him toward the road with the specific quality of parting that parents experience when a child is going toward exactly what they should be going toward, the grief and the pride so thoroughly mixed as to be indistinguishable. Bernard stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, the habitual gesture of 26 years, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and he understood that completely. William married Anne in 1910, in a ceremony that Effie planned with the precision she applied to undertakings she cared about, and that came off beautifully, in the same Caldwell church that had by now hosted 3 generations of county significance, and had the worn, warm quality of a space that has witnessed a great deal of genuine human importance. Mrs. Doyle, at 85 and in magnificently robust health, occupied her customary front pew and used her handkerchief comprehensively. Clara and Peter Gaines were living on his family's property to the east and had produced, in 1907, a grandson for Bernard and Effie named James, who was 3 years old and who had Effie's precise expression and Clara's determined personality, and was already fully convinced of the correctness of his own opinions, which the family found both familiar and entertaining. In 1912, the year that Woodrow Wilson was elected president and Kansas women were fighting actively for the vote, which Effie followed with the close attention of someone who had been writing about women's rights on the frontier for 30 years, and who was not going to miss this particular historical development from her kitchen table. Thomas Sullivan came home from Kansas City with his medical degree, and with a woman named Ruth, a Kansas City woman who was the daughter of a physician, and who had the specific combination of warmth and competence that Thomas's particular quality recognized and was drawn to, and who regarded the Sullivan homestead and the 40 Kansas acres and the parents of the man she had agreed to marry with the full and genuine interest of someone who understands that you are not simply marrying a person, but the place and the story that made them. Thomas introduced Ruth to Bernard and Effie on a Tuesday morning, which was entirely unplanned, and which Effie later told him she chose to take as a good omen. They sat in the kitchen and drank coffee, and Ruth asked questions about the land and the history of the property, with the attentiveness that Thomas had clearly valued in her, and Bernard answered them with the patience of a man who is pleased by genuine curiosity. And Effie watched this and thought about everything, and said very little, and was understood completely by her husband without a word, which is what 40 years of loving the same person can produce. Thomas settled his practice in Caldwell, taking over from the successor to the original Doc Halliday with the enthusiastic welcome of a community that understood the value of good medical care, and that considered Thomas Sullivan one of their own. Ruth adapted to Caldwell with the practical grace of someone who had come prepared to find it different from what she knew and had discovered it to be, in the ways that mattered, entirely livable, and in some of the ways she had not expected, genuinely beautiful. Bernard turned 60 in 1912, and the county celebrated this in the specific way frontier communities celebrate the people who have been part of them since before memory, with a gathering that was partly a party and partly a communal acknowledgement of something they valued. Effie had organized it with the help of Mrs. Doyle, who at 87 was still capable of organizing things through the pure force of personality and the absolute refusal to accept limitations, and William and Clara and Thomas had all contributed to it in their various ways. Bernard sat at the center of it with the expression he wore for things he found deeply touching and was determined not to perform his feelings about, the careful composure of a man who is containing something large, and Effie sat beside him through it all and watched the county come out for this man who had built his life here with his hands and his honesty and his quiet love of the things worth caring for, and she felt the full 30-year weight of it. all the way back to an August morning when a man had stood in her doorway and told her the truth. She told him, that night when they were home and the house was quiet, that she was glad every day for the broken latch. "It was never really broken," he admitted for the second time in 30 years. "I know," she said. "I've known for a very long time. You never said." "Neither did you," she pointed out, "for 4 months." He laughed, the full laugh that she had always loved, the one that arrived rarely and completely, and she laughed with him in the kitchen where everything had started, and it was everything, absolutely everything, that she had not known she was coming to Kansas to find. The years after 1912 settled into the full richness of a life in its later chapters, not diminished, but deepened, the way well-used things develop a quality that new things do not have. William and Anne had children of their own, a boy first in 1912 named Robert, who was a serious child with his grandfather's quiet eyes, and a girl in 1915 named Frances, who had Anne's warmth and William's precision, and was therefore someone the entire family adored immediately. Thomas and Ruth had their first child in 1914, a boy they named Henry, who arrived healthy and loud, and immediately confirmed that the Sullivan family's tendency toward strong opinions was robust across generations. Clara and Peter had added a daughter to James in 1911, named Margaret, and the Gaines Sullivan family gatherings, which happened several times a year with the casual regularity of people who live near each other and like each other, had become one of the structures of Effie's life that she valued with the specific depth of things that are irreplaceable. The homestead was handed formally to William and Anne in 1917, when Effie and Bernard moved into the smaller house that William had built for them at the north edge of the property, close enough to the main house to be part of the daily life of the family farm, far enough to be their own space, rather than guests in the life they had built and were now observing. Effie had been precise about this transition, had managed it with the same systematic attention she brought to every significant undertaking, ensuring that it was genuinely a handover rather than a retreat, that she and Bernard were choosing to give the land to the next generation rather than reluctantly conceding it. The smaller house was, by every objective measure, entirely adequate for 2 people, and it had a front door with a brand new latch that William had installed with great care, and that worked perfectly, which he had pointed out to both of them with the specific meaning of a son who knew the family story. Effie had tested the latch 3 times and declared it excellent work. Bernard had looked at it with the expression of a man reviewing something he fully understood and said simply, "Good." In their smaller house on the north edge of the property, with the Kansas sky above them, and the full 40 acres of their life's work visible from every window, Bernard and Effie Sullivan settled into the version of their life that came after everything else, the version that was simply themselves, 2 people who had loved each other for 35 years with the honest, patient, specific love that only grows larger with time rather than smaller. Effie still wrote. She always wrote. She had transitioned from the Kansas Farmer column to occasional pieces in larger publications, and she had begun, in 1918, to write something longer, a memoir of the frontier years that she approached with the same precision she brought to all her work, and that was taking shape, chapter by chapter and year by year, as something she believed might be worth reading by people who had not lived it. Bernard still fixed things. He always fixed things. The smaller house, and the main house, and the neighbors' houses, and the occasional piece of machinery that someone brought to him in the knowledge that Bernard Sullivan's assessment of a problem was reliable, and his solution of it equally so. He was slower at 70 than he had been at 30, but he was not less thorough, and thoroughness was the thing that had always mattered most. On a Tuesday morning in October of 1920, they sat at the small kitchen table in the North House with their coffee, as they had sat at every kitchen table in their life together on Tuesday mornings, and the October Kansas light came through the windows with the particular quality of early autumn light that Effie had described in print more than once, and never quite managed to fully capture, because some things are better experienced than described, which was a thing she had learned from living and not from books. 38 years, Effie said, meaning from the August morning when the latch had been admitted to, which was how she counted, from the moment of honesty rather than from the moment of meeting. 38 years, Bernard agreed. And every Tuesday still, she said. Every Tuesday, he said, and every day. She reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture of 40 years, the gesture that was as natural as breathing and as deliberate as a choice made new every morning. His hand was the hand of a man who had spent his life building and fixing and maintaining, large and capable and warm, and it held hers with the specific care that he had given to everything worth holding. Outside, the Kansas prairie went on in every direction under the deep October sky, the grass gone gold and bronze, the horizon so clear and far that it contained weather systems still 3 days away, and the 40 acres of their life's work lay quiet and productive and thoroughly tended, and the house where their children had been raised stood solid with William and Anne in it, and their children running in the yard, and somewhere to the east Clara and Peter's farm was going about its day. And in Caldwell, Thomas was seeing his patients with the quiet competence he had inherited from 2 different sources, and the world was exactly as it should be. "I am glad," said Effie Sullivan, who had come to Kansas broken and armored and certain she would never be glad of anything this large again, "that you could not stay away." "I am glad," said Bernard Sullivan, who had spent 4 months manufacturing a reason to come by because love had not yet given him a better option, "that you eventually asked me in." The Kansas morning light filled the kitchen, warm and unhurried, and the coffee was good, and the latch on the front door held firm, as it had always held since the day he fixed it properly, the day everything changed between them, and the prairie birds worked through their morning repertoire with the dedicated unself-consciousness of creatures who understand that the world is large enough for every kind of song. They sat together in the particular silence of 2 people who have said everything important and know that the important thing is the continuing saying of it, day after day and Tuesday after Tuesday, for all the years that remain and every year after that, in the only way that love is ever truly expressed, which is not in the dramatic moments alone, but in the long, faithful, everyday choice to keep choosing, to keep showing up, to keep fixing the things worth fixing, and to be honest about why.